Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Everybody, please have a seat. Thank you so much. Thank you. Please have a seat, everybody. It is wonderful to see all of you. I hope you had just the right amount of fun last night and not too much fun. You know, it's hard to believe that that was the final dinner Michelle and I get to host for you. Like me, some of you might be in the final year of your last term, working as hard as you can to get as much done as possible for the folks that you represent. Fixing roads, educating our children, helping people retrain, appointing judges, the usual stuff. Those of you who've been in office for a while have also witnessed all the progress that we have made together, and it has been a partnership. The millions of new jobs created, millions of people newly covered with health insurance, the new energy projects that are popping up all across every state that's represented here. I do want to comment, before I take questions, on the issue of security for the American people. Whatever our party, we all raise our hand and take an oath and assume the solemn responsibility to protect our citizens, and that is a mission that should unite us all as Americans. Today, we're focused on three threats in particular. First and foremost is terrorism. The attacks in Garland, Texas, in Chattanooga, in San Bernardino were attacks in good and decent communities, but they were also attacks on our entire country. As Americans, we are united in support of the men and women in uniform from every state who lead the coalition we've built with the mission to destroy ISIL. We're working with other nations to prevent terrorists from entering the United States. We're unwavering in our efforts to prevent attacks here at home, and that's where the partnership with your states come in. This is a shared mission. We have to stay vigilant. Across the country, we've got more than 100 joint terrorism task forces, federal, state, local experts working together to disrupt threats. And at the state level, your fusion cells are pushing information out to law enforcement. We also need to make sure our extraordinary law enforcement professionals and first responders have the equipment and the resources that they need. And we've got to stay united as one American family working with communities to help prevent loved ones from becoming radicalized and rejecting any politics that tries to divide the American people on the basis of faith. So this is something that, this is a shared project. It's not something that we do together. And one of the genuine areas of progress that I've seen since I came into office, and it was started in the previous administration, and this was one of the findings of 9/11, was breaking down some of the silos between federal, state, and local law enforcement when it comes to countering terrorism. We've made progress on that, but that's where state and local partners are absolutely critical. This is not something that the federal government can do alone, particularly because many of the attacks may end up being lone wolf attacks rather than those imported from the outside. The attack in San Bernardino killed 14 of our fellow Americans, and here's a hard truth. We probably lost even more Americans than that to guns this weekend alone. On Saturday, another one of our communities was terrorized by gun violence. As many of you read, 6 people were gunned down in a rampage in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Before I joined all of you, I called the mayor, the sheriff, and the police chief there and told them that they would have whatever federal support they needed in their investigation. Their local officials and first responders, by the way, did an outstanding job in apprehending the individual very quickly. But you got families who are shattered today. Earlier this year, I took some steps that will make it harder for dangerous people like this individual to buy a gun, but clearly we're going to need to do more if we're going to keep innocent Americans safe. And I've got to assume that all of you are just as tired as I am of seeing this stuff happen in your states. So that's an area where we also need to partner and think about what we can do in a common sense way, in a bipartisan way, without some of the ideological rhetoric that so often surrounds that issue. A second area of threats that we're focused on is cyber threats. The technology that connects us like never before also allows our adversaries to do us harm. Hackers and nations have targeted our military, our corporations, the federal government, and state governments. They're a threat to our national security. They're also a threat to our economic leadership. They're a threat to our critical infrastructure. They're a threat to the privacy and public safety of the American people. This is a complex challenge, and we're not going to be able to meet it alone. We've made a lot of progress these past 7 years, including sharing more information with industry and with your states. But all of us are still vulnerable. So this is why earlier this month I launched the Cybersecurity National Action Plan and proposed significant funding to push our cybersecurity efforts in a more aggressive direction. We're going to start a major overhaul of federal computer systems. I want to do more with your states, including sharing more information about threats, improving our joint response capabilities. We have initiated a joint bipartisan commission made up of one of my national security advisors, former national security advisors, Tom Donilon, but joined with the former CEO of IBM so that they can work together to help provide us a sense of direction both at the federal and state levels as well as the private sector in terms of how we move forward on this. We're going to want your input, and I think that we probably have some good ideas about where your vulnerabilities are in terms of your state databases and what you're doing there. So that's an area where I think we can profitably work together. Finally, we all have to remain vigilant when it comes to the spread of disease. Since late last year, my administration has been focused on the threat of Zika. So far, while there's no evidence of Zika transmission from mosquitoes here in the continental United States, there are confirmed cases in Puerto Rico. And as leaders, it's important that we convey very basic facts, including the fact that Zika is not like Ebola. Ebola was primarily spread from human to human. Based on what we know right now, Zika spreads predominantly through the bite of a certain kind of mosquito that's limited to certain parts of the country. Symptoms are generally very mild. Most folks don't even realize that they have it, but as all of you have read, the possible connection between Zika, birth defects, and other serious health problems means that we've got to take precautions, particularly with respect to women who are pregnant or are trying to get pregnant. So we're going to be fighting this disease at every level with every tool at our disposal. I've called on Congress to approve about $1.9 billion in emergency funding for our efforts at home and abroad, including research into better diagnostic tools, new vaccines, improved methods of mosquito control, and support for Puerto Rico and territories where there are confirmed cases. And we're going to be launching an aggressive coordinated campaign with the NGA to stop Zika at the source and keep Americans healthy. I hope each of you join us, especially if you're in some of the southern states where the risk of transmission may be higher. So fighting terrorism and gun violence, combating cyber attacks and cyber threats, guarding against the outbreak of disease, these are some areas where there shouldn't be any dispute. We've got to be working together to keep our country safe and strong. And I look forward to the partnership with the NGA in each and every one of you in all of these areas. I should point out that one of the things I'm proudest of over the course of the last 7 years is that the federal coordination with state and local governments with respect to disaster response, I think has been extraordinary. I'm really proud of the work that Craig Fugate and FEMA has done. I think that that kind of model of partnership across many of these threats is exactly what's needed to give the American people the confidence that their government's on their side when they need it most. All right? So with that, I'm going to take some questions, and I'm going to start with your chairman, Governor Herbert. You can use the microphone. There you go.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. We, again, are appreciative of your willingness to let us come in and talk with you and the Vice President about issues that are near and dear to us as governors and near and dear to us as an association with the NGA. I'm struck by the ability we've had to have cordial relationships with your cabinet, and I want to compliment your people there. In fact, one of them talked about the importance of communication and used the term cooperative federalism as really a way for us to get things done better in a collaborative fashion between the states and the federal government. I'll just mention one that comes to my mind, and that's working with your Department of Interior, Sally Jewell, as Secretary, during the federal shutdown. We were able to work together, communicate, and collaborate, and open up the 5 national parks in Utah to the benefit of the people of Utah and Americans and people, really world travelers overall. So again, an effort of communication and cooperation, which I think is a great success. I do hearken back to a failure, maybe an epic failure of lack of communication on a previous administration where a national monument was designated in Utah, larger than the state of Delaware, 2.5 times larger than Rhode Island. Still, that, the Vice President made a little.
Where's Jack?
Yeah. At any rate, the problem was that Governor Mike Leavitt then found out about that designation by reading the Washington Post. That was the other side of the coin of not good communication. I expect all governors have got successes and probably where we could do better. And so my question to you, Mr. President, really is in the effort of the National Governors Association. What can we do as an NGA, as states, to communicate better with the federal government? And what can the federal government do better to communicate with the states so that we have this spirit of cooperation? And really this should go post us. We're all right off in the sunset sometime, but it'd be nice if we had some kind of institutional process to make sure that we work together in a collaborative fashion, communicate better, and have better outcomes on behalf of the American people.
Good. Well, first of all, I think the NGA generally has been a terrific partner for us. I hope you feel the same way. My instructions to my cabinet, to my secretaries, have always been that we have certain laws, statutes, mandates that we have to abide by. We have certain policies that we care deeply about. But my instructions to them have been, you check with the governors and the localities that are being impacted, and if they have ideas about how to achieve the mission in a more flexible, sensible way, and we've got that flexibility, we should exercise it. And that's been my consistent message, and I think many of you have benefited from those kinds of interactions. What I do is Gary, throw the question back at you, not for today, but maybe one of the projects that we can do jointly together, is sort of do an inventory of what's worked and what hasn't institutionally in terms of communication. Where have been there areas where governors have been concerned that they haven't gotten the heads up fast enough? Where are the areas where communications has been strong? And let's see if we can improve that communication. But my overall impression has been communication with the cabinet secretaries has been good. I think that our Intergovernmental Affairs Office has tried to be very active. There may be some additional things that we could do to improve that, and I'd be happy to hear ideas from your side about what could be done. I will tell you that probably where there's the biggest gap in communications has to do with our interactions with governors versus our interactions with your congressional delegations. That's where oftentimes things diverge. So we'll have a conversation with the governors, and they'll identify a priority. We work out some approach to get something done, and then it turns out that the congressional delegations have an entirely different idea. And the biggest example would be on transportation, for example, where Anthony Fox probably traveled to every single one of your states, talked, and before that, Ray LaHood, talked about things that needed to get done. Everybody was excited about getting them done, but we just couldn't get Congress to move. And so one of the things that I think would be interesting as we explore better communications is how do we maybe create a triangle where we have some interaction with states, a state's governors and its congressional delegation at the same time. Now, sometimes that's difficult because there are different parties, maybe different political agendas. Sometimes, though, there may be commonality, and it's just a matter of closing the loop so that congressional staff know what the governor's staff is saying, know what our staff is saying. So,
why don't you just assign the Congress to that?
just assign the Congress to them generally. Well, they've got their own legislatures. I know that they enjoy those interactions tremendously. Next, Terry McAuliffe. Where's Terry? Here he is.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me first, great night last night. Thank you on behalf of all the governors. Shaka Khan. I've been listening to her for 40 years.
That was Michelle, basically, that put that together. I tried to take credit last night, and nobody believed me, and rightly so.
But let me just say that we just finished, Mr. President, 4 great days of the Governors Association with the great leadership of Gary. But Gary and I met with your team, Jerry, about 6 weeks ago, and Valerie. We laid out what we needed. Your administration gave us everything we needed. We had the secure briefing at the FBI. So let me just say this has been a great meeting. On behalf of all the governors here, let's give a round of applause to the administration and the great work that they did. We thank you very much. We're here from 50 states, different political parties. We all have different interests in our states, but one issue that brings a lot of us together is the issue of trade. It is a global economy that we have today. Many of us do international trade trips. I've done 13 in my first 2 years. I just got back from the Middle East and from Cuba. 95% of the world's customers live outside of America. 81% of the growth in the next 5 years will occur outside America. Trade is critical to grow our economies. So, Mr. President, could you give us an update on the trade policy, where the legislation is, and most importantly, what can we do to help you push trade with the Congress? Thank you.
Well, I appreciate that question, Terry. And Governor Herbert and I were talking about this a little bit yesterday. When I visited Utah, you told me how much of Utah's economy depends on exports and international trade. And that's true for so many of us. Now, maybe the way to answer this is to give sort of a broad overview of how I think the politics have shaped the narrative around trade, and then let me give you some of the facts and what's going on with TPP. Over our lifetimes, and certainly accelerated over the last 25, 30 years, this has become a global economy and not a national economy. The global supply chain, distribution, the fact that a company can set up house anywhere where there's an internet service, the fact that these big cargo containers can ship things more efficiently than ever before, the logistical hubs and speed with which they can move goods and services around the world, all of this has created a global marketplace. The good news is that we are best positioned to take advantage of this global marketplace than anybody else. We've got the best cards. We've got the best businesses. We've got the best technology, the best innovation. We've got the best workers. We are a free market, dynamic economy like nobody else. The challenge is that there have been disruptions as a consequence of that global trade. There's no doubt about it. And in every one of your states, there have been times where somebody has been affected. And not all the trade deals in the past were designed just to look out for workers. There were times where it was good for consumers. It was good for the businesses that may have found lower wages. But it wasn't always good for those communities that had big plants, particularly in manufacturing, that got shipped overseas. And that's made people suspicious about trade. and understandably so. You know, on the one hand, people benefit from low prices and low inflation, and the degree to which globalization has given people access to more products at lower prices than ever before. That's something that people maybe take for granted, but what they see very directly oftentimes around trade is this plant closed. You used to be able to walk in, even without a college education, get a job. If you worked hard, you'd have a middle-class life and benefits and health care and could take care of your family, and now those jobs have contracted. So that's the prism through which a lot of folks have been looking at trade. And I understand and I'm sympathetic, because I've seen this in my own home state, of why people are suspicious. But if you look at what's happened over the last 7 years since I came into office, first of all, exports drove the early part of this recovery. That was true in every state and in almost every sector. If you're an agricultural state, the ag community was making out great for the vast majority of this administration because of exports. Second thing that happened was we actually rebuilt manufacturing and started bringing manufacturing jobs back here, because what folks started to figure out was U.S. Workers have become so competitive, and we remain such a significant marketplace, and our energy costs here are low, that it makes sense oftentimes to locate here, even if you're paying a higher wage, because net, it's going to be more profitable. So we have created more manufacturing jobs than at any time since the 1990s, despite an open trade regime. And it is because of my confidence in our ability to compete and the fact that we have no choice but to compete that we said, where's the next big market where folks are selling us goods, but we're not able to sell them goods? And we looked at the Asia-Pacific region that is the fastest growing, most dynamic, youngest population in the world, and where invariably economic activity is going to be driving much of the world economy for decades to come. And our concern there was that China was the 800-pound gorilla, and if we allowed them to set trade rules out there, American businesses and American workers were going to be cut out. And if we got in there and we set the terms of trade, making sure that there were high labor standards, making sure that there were high environmental standards, making sure that intellectual property was protected, making sure that the things that we do well were protected, and that those countries that are selling to us right now but are keeping our goods out lowered those barriers. If we did all those things, then it would be an improvement for American businesses and American workers, and we would know that we would be able to compete in those areas for years to come. So we got TPP done. Mr. Michael Froman is here. He can, if he hasn't already, he will brief you on every paragraph, every comma, every T that's crossed and I that's dotted on the agreement. But the bottom line is this. It is, I believe, indisputable that once we have TPP in place, we, American companies, American workers, will be better off than the existing trade regime that we have right now. I mean, I'll just give you a very simple example. Right now, there are 18,000 tariffs, taxes essentially, on American goods and services that would all be eliminated. So if you got a rancher in Colorado, they can sell beef to Japan in ways that they cannot do right now, and that is a huge market for them. If you are interested in selling cars in Southeast Asia, right now, oftentimes they're going to slap a 70% tax on the value of the car, which means you're not competitive. We're going to bring those down. Nobody has described for me, none of the critics of this trade regime, trade deal, have described for me how we're better off with the current status quo, where those folks are all keeping tariffs high, than we would be with TPP. What they argue against is old trade deals, and I keep on explaining to them, look, I can't do anything about what may have happened 40, 30 years ago, but I can do something about what's going on right now. And by the way, because Mexico and Canada are signatories to this deal, it actually does strengthen labor and environmental protections within NAFTA, which previously had been one of the main complaints of critics. Now, having said all that, the emotions around trade are still strong. Labor unions, and I am a big labor guy, you know, they're not happy with me on this. They disagree with me because they have memories of this weakening the manufacturing base in America. And no matter how much I indicate that the facts show this will improve the position of American workers and we will slowly raise labor standards overseas as a consequence, they're adamant in their opposition. Which means that we have, in order to get this passed through Congress, have to depend on a set of strong pro-trade Democrats who recognize the importance of trade to their economies and their membership, their constituencies, and Republicans who historically at least have been in favor of the free market and in favor of trade. I am cautiously optimistic that we can still get it done. Leader McConnell and Speaker Ryan both have been supportive of this trade deal. They've had some concerns along the margins of the trade deal. You know, I'll just give you one example. With respect to tobacco, we said very explicitly in this trade deal that any country that regulates tobacco is not somehow violating trade agreements, as long as it's done fairly, as long as they're not discriminating against American tobacco companies versus their own or those of other countries, but as a public health matter, they can regulate tobacco. That raises some sensitivities in Kentucky. So, you know, there are those kinds of issues, but overall they have been supportive. The presidential campaigns have created some noise within and roiled things a little bit within the Republican Party as well as the Democratic Party around this issue. I think we should just have a good, solid, healthy debate about it. We're going to sign to enter this agreement, present it formally with some sort of implementation documents to Congress at some point this year, and my hope is that we can get votes. What Congress can do, or what all of you can do to help, is to talk to your congressional delegations and let them know this is really important. It is inconceivable if, for example, you are in California, that you don't want a Trans-Pacific partnership that ensures the gateway for commerce in the Pacific is open to California businesses and workers for decades to come. It's inconceivable that you'd be opposed to that. I mean, we've got longshoremen in California who are opposed to that. I said, where do you think your jobs come from? It's from moving stuff off those containers onto trucks and rail to fan out all across the country. This creates jobs for you. But that gives you some sense of some of the emotions that I think are sometimes blocking this up. All of you, though, can really lift up the benefits for your states and talk to your congressional delegations directly. Talk to your businesses, by the way, because they'll tell you how important this is to them. All right. Who else we got? Yep, go ahead.
Mr. President, Matt Mead from Wyoming. A great celebration is going on this year. It's the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service. And as the state with the first national park, we're very proud this a great opportunity for the country to celebrate parks and what they bring not only to our nation but to our world.
You got some pretty nice ones.
Well, you could even say the best if you really want to do it.
I wasn't going to go there, but they're really nice. I got to admit.
Just interested in accuracy, Mr. President. But anyway, Mr. President, thank you for last night. We all enjoyed that. So I'm chair of the Natural Resources Committee for the National Governors Association, and we had a good meeting this week. There was discussion, and certainly we don't all agree as governors in terms of sort of and national energy policy and where we should go. As you know, we are a big mineral state in Wyoming, and there's other mineral states here as well. And I know you've addressed climate change, and we may have different points of view on that. But it does seem, from my perspective, that if the concern is fossil fuels, we have to continue to invest in R&D to say, listen, it's real. I mean, coal produces 40% electricity in this country. If that's the concern, let's work to clean it up. We appreciate the work of the Secretary of Energy and doing that. We now see, though, a 5% reduction in R&D in terms of where that may go. And at least from our standpoint, we're investing in R&D in our state on how to make improvements in coal and other energy resources. And so I think from the national governor's perspective, what is the long-term view in how we make things better where we have areas of concerns? Thank you, Mr. President.
Sure. Well, I appreciate the constructive conversations that have taken place between the NGA and the energy-producing states. Number one, climate change is real. The science is clear. We can debate how we approach the problem, but we can't debate the science. I just have to be very clear about that. At least, you know, the analogy that I've used is that if you went to a doctor and he said, you've got a disease, and you said you want a second opinion, the second doctor said you had the disease, you went to 100 doctors and 99 of them said you had the disease, at a certain point you'd say, I got to do something about this. And that essentially is the situation with respect to climate change. 99% of scientists are saying this is a really serious problem, not a sort of kind of maybe off in the distant future problem. This is a problem that is going to get worse in the lifetime of our children and our grandchildren, and there is such a thing as being too late on this. Because if you start getting into a feedback loop where fundamental weather patterns and ocean temperatures are changing, we can't reverse it. And the effects will be profound. So that's point number one. Point number two is, in order to grow the economy, we've got to have energy. And economic growth remains a top priority for Democrats and Republicans alike, and every governor and every president, whoever takes my place, they're going to want to grow the economy. And by the way, that's true internationally. In fact, there are countries like India where it's even more desperate. They don't have electricity. They've got to produce electricity in order to develop. And if we aren't giving them options, if the only message we have for them is stay poor, we're not going to solve the problem. So this is not an either-or issue. We've got to grow the economy, which means we've got to produce energy, and we've got to deal with climate change. The good news is that technology and research and development are accelerating rapidly. And because of the Paris Agreement that we struck, you are going to see more investment from the private sector, not just from governmental sectors, and that is going to accelerate progress even more. You take an example like solar. When I came into office, we set goals that we thought were really ambitious. And the amount of solar energy that is being produced now and the unit costs dropping faster than any of us imagined means that we could be on a path where a huge portion of our energy needs can readily be provided through renewable energy, clean energy, much faster than any of us would have anticipated even a few years earlier. Now, with respect to those states that continue to have a significant traditional fossil fuel extractive set of industries, number one, we have not discouraged, we've encouraged production. Throughout my presidency, oil and gas production have gone up significantly. We have put ourselves in a position because of new technologies to produce more than ever before, and that's changed the geopolitical landscape. We have, Sally Jewell, I think, has been, and prior to her, Ken Salazar, have tried to be very flexible in thinking about how do we continue to meet our energy needs. We haven't shut down energy production outside of very sensitive areas that are of significant concern. The main shift that's taken place is because U.S. production's been so high, prices have plummeted, and that's changed the equation for private sector companies. That's a global price issue. And the second thing that's changed, frankly, is natural gas started supplanting coal because it became so cheap, and that hurt coal industries. Now, having said that, I continue to believe that there are areas of research and development that have to be done because we are going to continue to use fossil fuels for our lifetime. Those aren't going to immediately go away. And certainly they will be used in other countries. And if we can figure out how to make those cleaner, that helps all of us. I want India and China to know how to use clean coal because they're going to be building coal plants anyway. And if we've got technology that can help make sure that it's not emitting huge amounts of carbon, all the better. So historically, since I've come into office, we have invested in technologies to capture carbon from coal-fired plants. The technologies are there. The problem is that they're just really expensive right now, and so given relative prices to natural gas and other options, they haven't been deployed. We are going to continue to invest in trying to bring those costs down, but frankly, in this marketplace, it may be a while before it is economical for anybody to imagine wanting to use that. Ironically, what would actually accelerate clean coal technology, so-called clean coal technology, would be the work that we did in Paris to restrict the amount of carbon that's being produced. That means that it starts becoming more expensive to generate carbon, and there's greater incentive then to, for private sector dollars as well as public money to go into research and how do we capture coal. Similarly, when it comes to oil and gas, a lot of methane is generated from the extraction of oil and gas, and we want to invest in research that helps us figure out how to reduce the methane that also causes climate change. So my goal is to increase overall research and development dollars in the energy sector. We underinvest as a nation relative to, for example, our expenditures on healthcare research. I'm all for that. We've got our cancer moonshot, and we're significantly increasing our investment in medical research, but we should be doing the exact same thing on energy. How it's allocated is something that probably I'll make sure that Ernie meets with your governors to talk about. But I want to be honest with you. If those states with extractive industries are not currently preparing for the fact that the energy mix is going to continue to change over time, you're probably doing a disservice to your constituencies. And what we should be doing at the federal government level is helping maximize your production, minimizing your pollution, but also preparing you for the fact that 20, 30 years from now, there's going to be a higher mix of clean energy and a lower mix of traditional fossil fuels. That is almost inevitable. Even if there's somebody in this seat, in this White House, who disagrees with me on all this stuff, it's still going to happen, just because of the trend lines internationally. And we should prepare ourselves for that. All right? Yeah. Mark.
Mr. President, I've had the chance to speak with you before about the impact of China's dumping on Minnesota's iron ore, and thank you again for sending your chief of staff up to meet there. As I've talked with other governors here this weekend, the impact of the China's exports and dumping have been affecting a lot of other industries too, and I'm wondering if it's, given your emphasis on free trade, and you're right about that. If there's also a way that you can be more aggressive about preventing China from doing what it's doing.
Good. Well, first of all, the good news is we've been more aggressive than previous administrations when it comes to bringing enforcement actions. And, you know, this is an area where even the steel workers, as much as they may object to TPP, would acknowledge we've done a lot on this front. The other piece of good news is that we actually had a companion bill to our Trade Promotion Authority that just passed the House and the Senate and that I'm getting prepared to sign that will give us additional tools for enforcement. More resources, more personnel, allows us to take more aggressive actions. So you're going to see firm, tough enforcement of our existing trade laws. What is important is that we don't get confused by thinking that we should close off trade as an enforcement tool, because that is not possible. What is possible is making sure that everybody's playing on a level playing field and that people are operating fairly. And frankly, I don't think it's any secret that China in the past has not always operated fairly. They are now in a process where they're trying to transition their economic model. They recognize that they can't forever sustain an export-driven growth model, but it's going to take some time, and it's tempting for them to solve short-term problems by just dumping a bunch of state-subsidized goods into the U.S. market. And we've been very clear with them about the fact that that's not going to work. We're going to put in place tools to make sure it doesn't work. This is similar to the issue of currency manipulation. In the past, there has been currency manipulation by the Chinese. Right now, frankly, their interventions to prop up their currency rather than to devalue it, because a lot of people have been nervous about the Chinese economy. But we've said to them, you know, you've got to have an orderly, market-based currency system that's not designed to advantage your companies over ours. And we are consistently pushing them very hard in that, and we've got some new tools to make progress on that, thanks to the bill that was just passed. Yeah. Governor Hogan.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, as your next-door neighbor in Maryland, thank you again for the hospitality. And on a personal note, I want to thank you for you personally reaching out when I was going through my cancer battle. It meant an awful lot to me. I'm the chairman of the Economic Development and Commerce Committee for the NGA, and we had a terrific meeting on Saturday. I unfortunately was not in attendance because we had a funeral for one of our fallen law enforcement officers that killed in the line of duty, but Governor Tomlin from West Virginia did a terrific job running the meeting. He's the vice chair. There was a lot of terrific discussions that came out of that, a lot of agreement between the governors, a lot of bipartisan cooperation, and people focused on a number of important issues. One of them was regulatory reform, something that we're doing in Maryland and finding a lot of bipartisan support on. I think there are Democratic and Republican governors who believe that this is important to help us grow businesses and grow jobs. Right. And I believe it's something that you feel is important, and I remember last year when we had our meeting, you talked about that as well. So my question for you is, would you be willing to commit to have the administration work with the RGA, with a task force, on taking a look at this regulatory review at the federal, state, and local level?
Absolutely, although I think you said RGA, and I'm assuming you meant NGA.
Whoa,
but
whoa.
I'll work.
I was talking about bipartisanship and then said RGA. That was a big mistake. It was the NGA.
You just cut out your Democratic brethren here. No, just a quick word about regulation, and this, I think, reiterates something that I've said in the past. There are some regulations we have put forward that some of you don't like. More commonly, there are regulations that we are obliged to enforce. They didn't just pop out of our heads, but you know, we have to enforce them, and you don't like them. There's some regulations I don't like that I think are hugely inefficient, or were well-intended but proved not to work well, or just the economy's changed. I mean, my favorite example was there were a bunch of rules around rail, right, or trucks, where they didn't account for the fact that there's GPS now. And so what I have done is assigned my cabinet and the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, to work vigorously not only to scrub new regulations we may be proposing, but to look back and see what are the old ones on the books that don't make sense anymore. Now, the good news is we've made some progress. We don't get a lot of credit for that because, you know, it's sort of the dog that doesn't bark. If we get rid of wasteful regulations, we don't get a lot of applause for it. But we have eliminated tons of paperwork. We have eliminated tons of forms that have to be filled out. We have streamlined a whole lot of processes, and we're interested in doing more. And this is an area during the next year where we've got room to do more because we don't need Congress on a lot of this stuff to do it. So I am very much in favor of the NGA. Give us a list of those regulatory actions or constraints that you find most troublesome, most illogical, most frustrating. And I can't guarantee you that we will be able to eliminate all those regulations. Some of them may be statutory. We got no choice, even though we agree with you. Some of them, we may just not agree with you. I mean, there are going to be some environmental regulations where, you know, some governors think this is inconvenient, it's impeding development, and we're going to say, well, you know, this is protecting children's health, for example. And so there are going to be some areas of disagreement. My suspicion is there are going to be some areas where we really welcome your advice, and we'll do everything we can to see if we can strike some of these ineffective regulations off the books before we get out of here. So I'm very eager to work on you on this. And by the way, if any of you doubt my claim that we have actually eliminated a whole bunch of regulations, we can give you a whole manual. Sean Donovan knows because I've charged him with this, and prior to that, Mr. Froman and others, and Sylvia, before she was HHS Secretary, they've all been working on this. They know how important I think this is. I do not believe in regulation for regulation's sake, contrary to rumor. This idea that somehow I get a kick out of big government, it's just not the case. You know, the truth of the matter is, if something's working without us being involved, we got more than enough to do without getting involved in it. We really do. It's not like I'm waking up every morning thinking, how can I add more work for me? I don't think that way. So if there's something that we can stop doing or do smarter, do better, we're happy to do it. But a lot of times when folks say this is a bad regulation that's burdening government and not helping anybody, they're just looking at one side of the equation, and when you actually subject it to the cost-benefit analysis, it turns out that it's saving a lot of lives, it's keeping a lot of people out of the hospital, it's, you know, it's making a big difference. I should mention, by the way, when I was coming up back in the 80s, when I was a law student, cost-benefit analysis was considered a really radical conservative idea. And this administration has been more vigorous in applying cost-benefit analysis than any prior administration, including the one that just preceded me. I mean, we have been very stringent and very tight, and our numbers all check out when it comes to the costs and the benefits that we apply to these tests. Even on some of the big regulations you hear about that you don't like, they're not issued unless we think that the benefits substantially outweigh the costs. And we have the numbers to prove it. So for those of you who think that I'm just a big government crazy liberal, you know, we're actually, we've crunched some numbers around here. We take it very seriously. Yeah. Okay.
Mr. President, thank you. I'm always amazed to be in these sessions where you spend so much time with us, and your next answer is even more brilliant than the last. So thank you so much for being such a great
He's
president.
a Democrat, isn't he?
You can't get over it. A Republican just said that to me.
Yeah.
We spoke on Friday a little about the opiate crisis. I want to give you both an update and ask you a question. I think that we are probably united in making real progress across America, governors, Congress folks, certainly you and your administration, in helping us to fight this battle. And as someone who was on the front lines of this pretty early, you know, I think much like your frustration with the gun challenges, where you're constantly consoling moms and dads and parents, we had at our Health and Welfare Committee, which is chaired by Governor Baker and Governor Hassan, we heard from another mom who lost her son. There was someone there who told me that they had, in their state, one of our governors had a family lose their son and their daughter. So I think what we're all trying to do, and frankly, Director of the FBI, Loretta Lynch, is a huge partner to us in this, is do criminal justice reform, start treating this as a disease and not a crime, get treatment built out as fast as we can, and get Narcan out as fast as we can so we stop losing lives unnecessarily. Those are the three things I think that we all are doing in some way. I mentioned on Friday, if one of my challenges, and I think other governors are finding this, is as you build out treatment, particularly in rural America, we can't get enough docs who are able to meet the demand of our waiting lists. So if we could get physician assistants, nurse practitioners to be able to prescribe the recovery drugs, we'd all be better off. I mean, as you probably know, they can now pass this stuff out. They can, you know, prescribe OxyContin. Then we don't let them prescribe the stuff that gets you off the OxyContin. But the most important one, and I just want to give you an update, our committee voted unanimously to adopt protocols on prescribing practices for OxyContin and other painkillers. And I'm just curious, you know, we can do that as governors. It takes time. It's not, doesn't apply to all 50 states. When you look at the numbers on this stuff, it's just staggering. Now, I know you know this, but in 2010, we prescribed enough OxyContin to keep every adult in America high for a month. In 2012, we prescribed enough OxyContin to give 250 million doses, to give every adult American their own personal bottle. And I guess I'm asking you if by rule or with putting pressure on FDA, you might consider a national approach which simply says, you know, for minor procedures, we're going to limit this to 10 pills, and after that, you got to come back for more, because there is a direct correlation between the lives we're losing. The kids are the biggest victims of this. I've got my agency at Human Services struggling to come up with enough foster kids as we put more and more kids into custody because their parents do horrid things to them when they're under the influence of this stuff. It is such an epidemic, you know, and if this was, we're losing 130 people a day. If this was, imagine that we were losing 130 people a day in America to terrorism. I mean, you know, we've got to come up with a more rational approach to prescribing prescription drugs. To be candid, the docs, the AMA are resistant to listening to politicians like us talking about how many pills to prescribe, but is there something you could do on a national level that would help us get out of this tragic mess?
Okay. Well, first of all, I appreciate the work that Governor Baker and Governor Hassan and you and others are doing on this. As all of you know, I went down to West Virginia and had an entire hearing on this, and yeah, the stories you hear are heartbreaking. And what was striking was the number of high-ranking elected officials in the state whose own families had been affected directly by this. And so the good news is that there is strong bipartisan support to address this issue. I would be remiss if I didn't also say the good news is that the broader society is recognizing the importance of taking a public health approach as well as a criminalization approach when it comes to drug addiction and abuse generally. Because I think when it was isolated to certain low-income communities or minority communities, the tendency was jail was a sufficient deterrent or approach. And as it has affected a broader and broader cross-section of America, people start realizing, you know, this is a complicated problem. There has to be a law enforcement element, but there also has to be a public health element to it. I want to thank Sylvia Burwell's been at the front lines of this at HHS, also, by the way, a native West Virginian, so she's seen her own community affected by this. Loretta Lynch has been hugely active in thinking about how does the criminal element of this fit with the public health process. I want to recognize Tom Vilsack as well, though, one of your own as a former governor, who's been outstanding in chairing our rural council. And just 2 weeks ago, Tom convened a meeting in which we said, how do we get all hands on deck, all the agencies to focus on this in a comprehensive way? And my hope is that they've started to share with you and your committee what it is that we're looking at. I think there's going to be a lot of overlap. My suspicion is we're going to be seeing the same things. A couple of points I just want to make very quickly. Number one, the most striking statistic that came out of that meeting, and I wasn't in the entire meeting, was that in 85% of rural counties in America, there is insufficient or none or no drug treatment or mental health treatment available. So part of what's happening here, we talked about this at an earlier meeting, Peter. You know, you've got somebody who works on a farm, gets injured, they don't even have a doctor close by. It takes them 2 hours to drive, and finally the pain gets so bad they head out there. They get to the doctor. They don't necessarily have health insurance, although they should at this point, depending on what state they're living in. Just a small comment on the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid expansion. But if they don't have health insurance, they drive out and the doc says, well, you know what, you need an operation, you need rotator cuff surgery, you need this, you need that. Doc, I can't afford that. Can you just give me something to kill the pain? They get a bottle, they drive off, they get hooked on it, and then it turns out that it's a lot cheaper to refill the prescription with heroin on the street than it is to try to manage getting more of these pills. And then folks are off to the races. And what we've seen is that those who are marketing heroin are now tracking where which communities are most vulnerable. So what we have to do, I think, is to make a big push for additional treatment and mental health services in rural communities generally, make a big push for public health and prevention in communities generally, and then have a very specific approach to working with the docs, the hospitals, the providers, so that they are not overprescribing. And that can be done at a national level, but it is most profitably done, I think, if we have bipartisan support from the governors, so that by the time it gets to the national level, there's consensus and there's not a lot of politics involved in it. But I guess my point, the reason I raised the general issues of public health is that if we go to the doctors right now and say don't overprescribe, without providing some mechanisms for people in these communities to deal with the pain that they have or the issues that they have, then we're not going to solve the problem. Because the pain's real, the mental illness is real, In some cases, addiction's already there. In some cases, these are underserved communities when it comes to the number of doctors and nurses and practitioners. I agree with you, by the way, that we should be pushing the doctors. This is true for our healthcare system generally. Advanced practice nurses and physician's assistants can do more than they currently are allowed to do. And that could save the whole system money, but it could also prevent some of the overprescribing that is currently taking place. But we're looking at a comprehensive approach. What I'd suggest, Cynthia, have you guys already met with the governor's task force on this? To
This time, but we will follow directly.
Good.
Had a chance to.
Yeah, but we're all over this, and we appreciate your interest. This is an area where I can get agreement from Bernie Sanders and Mitch McConnell. That doesn't happen that often, but this is one, and it indicates the severity of the issue. All right. Yeah.
As a non-Democrat, I can't be quite as gratuitous, but I do appreciate the graciousness, the generosity of your time, Mr. President.
Thank you.
Quick question, something that affects each of us as governors individually is debt. It's crippling to some of us, less so to others. Curious as to your thoughts on the debt of this nation and the lack of any political discourse on either side of the aisle in any of the debates on this issue, and what in the next 10 months your administration can do to draw attention to this, to address it, to change, start to change the course of direction that is currently underway.
Well, we're going to be releasing a budget, so that will be a significant topic of conversation. Maybe I'll just break it out into its component parts. Obviously, the federal government, unlike state governments, does not have in the Constitution that at the end of each year it has to balance its budget. I know that there are those in this room who would probably be for the federal government having a balanced budget amendment. I would not be one of those because in modern economic history, what is clear is that there has to be some flexibility for the federal government, the sovereign nation, to issue debt in order to deal with recession, national emergencies, and so on. What is also true is the way that the federal government keeps the books is different than an ordinary business. A lot of times people will use a family or a business as an example, but just to take one instance, the federal government doesn't have a separate accounting for capital expenditures, which would then depreciate, and so you'd have a whole nother way of doing bookkeeping. There you go. That happens to me all the time. So the analogy is not exactly the same as the federal government versus state governments or businesses or families. Now, having said that, the good news is that since I came into office, we've reduced the deficit by 2/3. That is a combination of the recovery, which brought in more tax revenue, raising taxes on the top 2%, which everybody claimed was going to be a jobs killer, but we've now had 14 million jobs created or more, essentially over the last 6 years. And we've made some cuts in spending. And all of that has led to a 2/3 reduction. And that, our budget will reflect, we will sustain, more or less, in the out years over the next decade. The real problem that we have when it comes to debt is very simple. It is that our population is getting older, and we use a lot of health care. And health care, we spend more for less, frankly, than most other advanced nations, partly because we do a lot of emergency room care. Some of it is because we overprescribe, we overtest. Some of it is we drive innovation and technology and people always want the best stuff, but that costs money. Some of it is because the accident of how our healthcare system evolved means that we got private sector involvement and they've got to make a profit and they've got overhead and so forth. So there are a whole bunch of reasons, but essentially we spend about 6 to 8% more than our wealthy nation counterparts per capita on healthcare. That delta, that difference, is our debt. And that is the reason why, since I came into office, I was interested in reforming healthcare. It was not just the compassion I felt for people personally being impacted, getting sick and losing their home, or not being able to get care for their kids, or having to go to the emergency room because of routine issues that should have been dealt with by a primary care physician. It also had to do with the fact that this system is hugely inefficient, and if we don't make it more efficient, then we're not going to solve our debt problem. So what you'll see reflected, I think, in the budget that I present is we have stabilized what we're adding to it each year in terms of discretionary spending, taxes, revenue, income. But what we're going to have to tackle long term is healthcare spending. And if we don't do that, then we can cut food stamps, and we can cut WIC programs, and we can cut education programs, and you can cut out Head Start. You can cut out every single discretionary program that Democrats support and a lot of governors, Republican governors support, but sometimes members of Congress say are wastes or big government or what have you. You can get rid of all that discretionary spending. It won't matter because the big ticket item is Medicare, Medicaid, and in the private sector, the big ticket item, that's where the inflation is on the healthcare side. So, so my hope is that we get into a serious conversation. Maybe it'll have to happen once I'm gone, because the Affordable Care Act and the debate around healthcare has gotten so politicized, so toxic, that we can't have a sensible conversation about it, despite the fact that I implemented a measure that was passed by a Republican governor, but that's a whole other question. And we've embraced cost-saving measures that used to be championed by Republicans, and then suddenly now this is some Obama scheme or plot. But maybe once I'm gone, we can go back to have a sensible conversation between Democrats and Republicans about how we should incentivize greater efficiency, better outcomes, higher quality for lower cost in our healthcare system. And if we do that, that's going to make the biggest difference. The single biggest thing that we were able to do to bring down any additions to the debt since I've been in office was over the last 3 to 4 years, we've kept healthcare inflation at its lowest rate in 50 years, since the Affordable Care Act passed. And because of that, the Medicare Trust Fund, we essentially saved well over $100 billion. I think it was about 160, and counting, just by making healthcare more efficient. And by the way, people got just as good or better care. This wasn't done through rationing. It wasn't done through us cutting people out of the program. It just had to do with better delivery. That's part of the reason, by the way, why I think that Medicaid expansion, where it has been implemented, is smart. It is going to prevent you from having bigger problems down the road that your states are going to have to pay for. I don't expect any of you to agree with me right now, but if you just look at where it's been implemented effectively, it's going to save you money over the long term. It's been done really well in Kentucky, but that's a whole nother question. I got time for one more question or two? I'm going to make it two. Jack.
Mr. President, thank you. On a topic that I know is of significant interest to you, and the Attorney General talked to us earlier about criminal justice reform. You know, most of our conversation here is always about policy, but I do have one specific thought regarding your convening power, which I have seen play out incredibly well when it comes to some health care issues as well as some college access issues. We all know that one of the most important predictors regarding whether the 97% of the people who are in our prisons, when they come out, whether or not they're going to be on a decent path, is whether or not they can get a job. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of great work going on around the country, both Democratic and Republican governors alike. The beauty of this is it really is a bipartisan issue. But in addition to all the great policy work that's being done, one of the most important things, I think, is getting employers to the table. And this is an issue, as I was speaking with Valerie last night, an issue I was invited a couple months ago to New Orleans by the Koch brothers to speak at a conference on criminal justice reform. Never really expected to be invited by the Koch brothers to speak at something, but really doing some terrific work. But I do think there really is an opportunity to get employers across the country to the table to recognize the importance of this issue, the fact that a lot of these folks can actually do a good job. And I think if we can move the needle not only on all the policy work, but on also getting employers to take a chance on some folks, a lot of them really very low-risk ex-offenders, we can really make a difference. We can keep them out of prison and contributing. Because I think we all recognize that, you know, there's just no way we as a country, we as any community can be successful when we have so many able-bodied, able-minded people who are staying on the fringes. And we have lots of populations in that category, but I think the ex-offenders is one specifically where the White House's convening authority could make a huge difference.
Good. Well, I appreciate that, Jack. Let me compliment a number of governors around this table who've initiated their own reforms at the state level. Part of the reason why we have confidence that we can do crime smarter, keep crime rates low, reduce long-term sentences for nonviolent offenders is because there are a lot of states that already showed the way, including some very conservative states. I mean, this is an area where, for example, Texas did some really smart stuff, and it's worked. And so I would urge all of you to take a look at what's been done in, at the state level, as well as some of the data and reports that we're generating as we push for federal criminal justice reform. But to your specific point, I was up in Newark to highlight best practices. And there was a federal judge there, relatively young woman, district court judge, who had partnered with the local community, the U.S. attorney there. They'd gotten a little bit of money out of a tiny little program that we're trying to expand within the Justice Department to make reentry work. And there was a young man who was there, who was 37 years old, had spent 10 years in prison, had gotten in trouble before that, then finally got nabbed for a serious, though nonviolent, drug offense, went to jail for 10 years, and he described what it was like. He had decided he was going to turn his life around. And he gets out, and by lying on his resume, he gets a job at a Burger King. And he's dropped off in the same neighborhood that had produced him and had gotten him into this trouble. And so he's standing there, 27-year-old or 30-year-old man, you know, wearing the Jack in the Box, I think it was Jack in the Box outfit. And, you know, his old gangbanger friends are coming up and saying, man, you know, you're wearing the same shoes you went into jail with. And, you know, are you sure you want to keep on doing this for minimum wage? And he described the temptations that were involved. He didn't have permanent housing. He didn't have money for a car. He didn't have new clothes. He had no idea how to write a resume, but he wanted to do the right thing. And this program, the federal judge dug into her own pocket. In some cases, the probation officers were this great team, incredible, really humane, caring folks. helped him get into a community college, helped him study to become an EMT, and by the time I met him, he's like a 37-year-old man who is working for the state as an EMT, paying taxes, law-abiding, mentoring younger people. And the amount of money that was spent to save this young man was a fraction of what it cost to incarcerate him. And the likelihood of recidivism has dropped precipitously as a consequence of him having a whole new identity. So what that tells me is that we can be really smart about this, and I'm very proud that there's been bipartisan support around this. I do think that there's a convergence of liberals, conservatives, evangelicals who have terrific prison missions and believe in redemption, libertarians who are concerned about the growth of prison populations, the fiscal conservatives who are concerned about how much all this stuff costs, and it's all coming together. So, but the last point I'll make about this is the role of employers. There was, at this same roundtable, this young man who had had a family business for years. And for years, they had hired ex-offenders, very quietly, not as a systematic thing. It was a produce and meat wholesaler. And they'd hire guys in. And so this kid, who's now running the company, this young man who had inherited the company, he described how when he was growing up, there'd always be some big guys around that he just took for granted, and turned out that his dad had hired them as ex-offenders. And he described how important it was to understand the mentality of somebody who has never had an opportunity to work before in a regular setting. Simple things like the employer has to understand that they may not smile right off the bat, because where they've just come from, if you smile, you don't know what might happen to you. And so there's a whole adjustment process in terms of letting your guard down. Talking about how the employer has to make an investment and say, look, you need the right kind of shoes, and you need the right clothes for the cooler. And we're going to take this out of your check, but if you're here for 6 months, we'll pay for it. Just all the steps that are taken. And when an employer ends up being committed like that, what they've discovered is that they will not have a more loyal employee who will go to bat for them, work harder, be more productive, because they've been given a second chance. And so us getting sort of a critical mass of employers who are willing to give that second chance, I think it has to be part of this whole process. All right, last question. Go ahead. My host for my outstanding Alaska trip. Those of you who have not gone to Alaska, I strongly recommend you go, because it was gorgeous up there. Now, I did go there in the summer. I don't know what it's like during the winter.
Oh, it's even
a little cold, isn't it?
It's even nicer in the winter.
That's what I hear.
I just want to quickly thank you and your administration for what you've done in Alaska. I've been governor for 1 year. Every cabinet member here I have met with so many times, some more than they wanted to. They've been to Alaska. Secretary Moniz, we had lunch in Bethel last week and went out to the village of Oscarville. Mr. President, Alaska was so excited about your unprecedented trip. We get a lot of visits with people that are refueling, and you did refuel, but you stayed there and came back. That was your destination. What you did with rural Alaska, we've never seen before. You brought a hope and an excitement there and I'm saying I'm nonpartisan. I can do this. I mean, I'm the only nonpartisan governor in the nation, so I don't have to worry about if I'm picking sides on one or the other. You are as well. Okay. But my question is, I'm going to continue to work with your administration, because the doors are always open. We don't always agree. We have a problem. I inherited a similar situation. I've got a deficit that is huge, a $4 billion deficit with a $5.6 billion budget. We got problems. We have an oil pipeline that's empty. I need to fill it up. There's a lot of oil up there, and we're going to get it safely. And thank you for some of your positions you've taken. But we need to put oil in that pipeline. We need access to 1% of our national park to be able to do that. So I'm going to continue to work with your administration on Medicaid expansion and put Yet I accepted it unilaterally after the legislature didn't approve or didn't vote. 10,000 more people have health care, and one law firm has more work because they sued me as a result of that. But that's okay. That's another story. But thank you very much for what you've done. Thank you.
I appreciate that, and I mean what I say. The Bill's hospitality up in Alaska was extraordinary. It fills up your soul being up there. Just the landscape and the expanse, the sheer scale of everything is remarkable, and the people could not have been more gracious and wonderful. This goes back to the issue we talked about earlier in terms of energy. We have encouraged exploration in some areas. There's some areas that are just real sensitive. And one of the ironies when you're up in Alaska, and I mean this sincerely, it shows you that everybody can be two minds about this. I'd have some people say, in the same breath, protect this beauty and scenic areas and make sure that nobody's polluting it. And then, oh, and by the way, let's get going on some oil drilling at the same time. And our goal has been to try to balance those equities and to make sure that economic development's taking place in Alaska, that folks are being well served, but that we're also preserving the very thing that makes that place so unique and people care about it so deeply. And I appreciate what you said, though, Bill. We are always going to work with all of you. And we will put all our cards on the table. My instructions to my cabinet are listen. If you can find a way to make something work, make it work. If you can't, at least explain why it is you can't. Make sure that it's not just because that's how we've always done things. I don't care how we've always done it in the past. If we can do it smarter this time, let's do it smarter this time. As a consequence, we've made significant progress with many of you on a number of issues. We can make even more over the next year. Since this will be the last meeting in which I'm addressing all of you, I just want to thank all of you for your service. Part of the reason we invited the cameras here, usually when I have Q&A with anybody, we try to restrict the press just so that people feel open and don't feel like if they ask a question that they have to be guarded about it. But the truth is, after so many years of interacting with you, every time we've had a conversation, it's been constructive and useful. And I thought it'd actually be useful for the American people to see that, the folks in charge aren't always just posturing. They're actually trying to get some work done. You guys are a good model of that. And my hope is that that seeps into the broader political debates and conversations that we have. The benefit of being a chief executive, of being a governor, is that you can make as many political arguments as you want, but if the stuff doesn't work, people are going to notice. And all of you have taken that to heart, so we appreciate your sacrifice, we appreciate your family's sacrifice, and we look forward to making continued progress in the months to come. And for those of you who are not term limited, good luck. All right.
May the peace and mercy of God be with you. My name is Sabah Mukhtar, a biology major on a pre-medical track at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, with the aspirations to serve our underserved population. In these uncertain times, some of us might find ourselves doubting where we fit in this society. Personally, this visit by our president is an affirmation to all Muslims we are just as American as any other. It's a gesture that invites inclusiveness of all faiths and color. More importantly, it's an assurance for the Muslim American kids constantly bombarded by anti-Islamic rhetoric that they belong. Fortunately, I've had personal interactions that have allowed me to reach a much different perspective than what is normally portrayed on the media. When most see this piece of cloth on my head, I don't automatically get deemed terrorist. Rather, most see me as an individual. My experiences have taught me that most are accepting and believe regardless of faith, color, or gender, we are all Americans, and as such, we are all obligated to uphold the rights of every individual. Connecting with my community here at ISB allowed me to form my Muslim identity. My journey to where I am today started the first day I decided to wear my hijab as a junior in Pikesville High. I was so nervous to walk down the streets to my bus stop thinking, what will my friends think? That I'm a terrorist? While I did receive a few remarks as such, most were reassuring, like Jake from my bus stop, who nodded at that thing on my head and said, hey, that's pretty cool. Never did I feel as though I wasn't part of the community. I was just as American and just another high schooler. And assertions as such are what gave me the confidence to be who I am today. And I strongly believe to a lot of Muslims out there, the appearance of our president in our local mosque today does exactly just that. And personally, reassures me that I, a proud, Black, Muslim, African American, I'm just as American and have the obligation to fulfill my loyalty to my country as any other. So thank you, Mr. President, for this historic visit that will serve to inspire every American to engage in the work of building bridges across communities. And now, it is my honor to introduce to you the President, our President of the United States, President Barack Obama.
Please be seated. Well, good afternoon. And Sabah, thank you for the wonderful introduction and for your example, your devotion to your faith and your education and your service to others. You're an inspiration. You're going to be a fantastic doctor. And I suspect, Sabah, your parents are here because they wanted to see you. So where's Sabah's parents? There you go. Yay. Let's give. Good job, Mom. She did great, didn't she? She was terrific. To everyone here at the Islamic Society of Baltimore, thank you for welcoming me here today. I want to thank Muslim American leaders from across this city and this state, and some who traveled even from out of state to be here. I want to recognize Congressman John Sarbanes, who is here, as well as two other great leaders in Congress and proud Muslim Americans, Congressman Keith Ellison from the great state of Minnesota, and Congressman Andre Carson from the great state of Indiana. Now, this mosque, like so many in our country, is an all-American story. You've been part of this city for nearly half a century. You serve thousands of families, some who've lived here for decades, as well as immigrants from many countries who've worked to become proud American citizens. Now, a lot of Americans have never visited a mosque. And to the folks watching this today who haven't, think of your own church or synagogue or temple. And a mosque like this will be very familiar. This is where families come to worship and express their love for God and for each other. There's a school where teachers open young minds, kids play baseball and football and basketball, boys and girls. I hear they're pretty good. Cub Scouts, Girl Scouts meet, recite the Pledge of Allegiance here. With interfaith dialogues, you build bridges of understanding with other faith communities, Christians and Jews. There's a health clinic that serves the needy, regardless of their faith. And members of this community are out in the broader community, working for social justice and urban development. As voters, you come here to meet candidates. As one of your members said, just look at the way we live. We are true Americans. So the first thing I want to say is two words that Muslim Americans don't hear often enough, and that is thank you. Thank you for serving your community. Thank you for lifting up the lives of your neighbors and for helping keep us strong and united as one American family. We are grateful for that. Now, this brings me to the other reason I wanted to come here today. I know that in Muslim communities across our country, this is a time of concern and, frankly, a time of some fear. Like all Americans, you're worried about the threat of terrorism. But on top of that, as Muslim Americans, you also have another concern, and that is your entire community so often is targeted or blamed for the violent acts of the very few. The Muslim American community remains relatively small, so several million people in this country, and as a result, most Americans don't necessarily know, or at least don't know that they know, a Muslim personally. And as a result, many only hear about Muslims and Islam from the news after an act of terrorism or in distorted media portrayals in TV or film, all of which gives this hugely distorted impression. And since 9/11, but more recently since the attacks in Paris and San Bernardino, you've seen too often people conflating the horrific acts of terrorism with the beliefs of an entire faith. And of course, recently we've heard inexcusable political rhetoric against Muslim Americans that has no place in our country. No surprise then that threats and harassment of Muslim Americans have surged. Here at this mosque, twice last year, threats were made against your children. Around the country, women wearing the hijab, just like Saba, have been targeted. We've seen children bullied. We've seen mosques vandalized. Sikh Americans and others who are perceived to be Muslims have been targeted as well. I just had a chance to meet with some extraordinary Muslim Americans from across the country who are doing all sorts of work. Some of them are doctors. Some of them are community leaders, religious leaders. All of them were doing extraordinary work, not just in the Muslim community, but in the American community. And they're proud of their work in business and education and on behalf of social justice and the environment and education. I should point out they were all much younger than me, which is happening more frequently these days. And you couldn't help but be inspired hearing about the extraordinary work that they're doing. But you also could not help but be heartbroken to hear their worries and their anxieties. Some of them are parents, and they talked about how their children were asking, are we going to be forced out of the country? Or are we going to be rounded up? Why do people treat us like that? Conversations that you shouldn't have to have with children. Not in this country. Not at this moment. And that's an anxiety echoed in letters I get from Muslim Americans around the country. I've had people write to me and say, I feel like I'm a second-class citizen. I've had mothers write and say, my heart cries every night thinking about how our daughter might be treated at school. A girl from Ohio, 13 years old, told me, I'm scared. A girl from Texas signed her letter, a confused 14-year-old trying to find her place in the world. These are children just like mine. And the notion that they would be filled with doubt and questioning their place in this great country of ours, at a time when they've got enough to worry about. It's hard being a teenager already. That's That's not who we are. We're one American family, and when any part of our family starts to feel separate or second class or targeted, it tears at the very fabric of our nation. It's a challenge to our values, and that means we have much work to do. We've got to tackle this head on. We have to be honest and clear about it, and we have to speak out. This is a moment when, as Americans, we have to truly listen to each other and learn from each other. And I believe it has to begin with a common understanding of some basic facts. And you know, I express these facts, although they be obvious to many of the people in this place, because unfortunately it's not facts that are communicated on a regular basis through our media. So let's start with this fact. For more than 1,000 years, people have been drawn to Islam's message of peace. And the very word itself, Islam, comes from salam, peace. The standard greeting is, Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. And like so many faiths, Islam is rooted in a commitment to compassion and mercy and justice and charity. Whoever wants to enter paradise, the Prophet Muhammad taught, let him treat people the way he would love to be treated. And for Christians like myself, I'm assuming that sounds familiar. The world's 1.6 billion Muslims are as diverse as humanity itself. They are Arabs and Africans. They're from Latin America to Southeast Asia, Brazilians, Nigerians, Bangladeshis, Indonesians. They are white and brown and black. There's a large African American Muslim community. That diversity is represented here today. A 14-year-old boy in Texas who's Muslim spoke for many when he wrote to me and said, we just want to live in peace. So here's another fact. Islam has always been part of America. Starting in colonial times, many of the slaves brought here from Africa were Muslim. And even in their bondage, some kept their faith alive. A few even won their freedom and became known to many Americans. And when enshrining the freedom of religion in our Constitution and our Bill of Rights, our founders meant what they said when they said it applied to all religions. You know, back then, Muslims were often called Mohammedans. And Thomas Jefferson explained that the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, he wrote, was designed to protect all faiths. And I'm quoting Thomas Jefferson now, the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan. Jefferson and John Adams had their own copies of the Quran. Benjamin Franklin wrote that even if the Mufti of Constantinople were to send a missionary to preach to us, he would find a pulpit at his service. So this is not a new thing. Generations of Muslim Americans helped to build our nation. They were part of the flow of immigrants who became farmers and merchants. They built America's first mosque, surprisingly enough, in North Dakota. America's oldest surviving mosque is in Iowa. The first Islamic center in New York City was built in the 1890s. Muslim Americans worked on Henry Ford's assembly line, cranking out cars. A Muslim American designed the skyscrapers of Chicago. In 1957, when dedicating the Islamic Center in Washington, D.C., President Eisenhower said, "I should like to assure you, my Islamic friends, that under the American Constitution and in American hearts, this place of worship is just as welcome as any other religion. And perhaps the most pertinent fact, Muslim Americans enrich our lives today in every way. They're our neighbors, the teachers who inspire our children, the doctors who trust us with our health, future doctors like Saba. They're scientists who win Nobel Prizes, young entrepreneurs who are creating new technologies that we use all the time. They're the sports heroes we cheer for, like Muhammad Ali and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Hakeem Olajuwon. And by the way, when Team USA marches into the next Olympics, one of the Americans waving the red, white, and blue will be a fencing champion wearing her hijab. Ibtihaj Muhammad, who is here today. Stand up. Come on, let me... There you go. I told her to bring home the gold. Not to put any pressure on you. Muslim Americans keep us safe. They're our police and our firefighters. They're in Homeland Security, in our intelligence community. They serve honorably in our armed forces, meaning they fight and bleed and die for our freedom. Some rest in Arlington National Cemetery. So, Muslim Americans are some of the most resilient and patriotic Americans you'll ever meet. We're honored to have some of our proud Muslim American service members here today. Please stand if you're here, and so we can thank you for our service. So part of the reason I want to lay out these facts is because in the discussions that I was having with these incredibly accomplished young people, they were pointing out that so often they felt invisible, and part of what we have to do is to lift up the contributions of the Muslim American community, not when there's a problem, but all the time. Our television shows should have some Muslim characters that are unrelated to national security. Right? Because it's not that hard to do. Now, there was a time when there were no black people on television. And you can tell good stories while still representing the reality of our communities. Now, we do have another fact that we have to acknowledge. Even as the overwhelming majority, and I repeat, the overwhelming majority of the world's Muslims embrace Islam as a source of peace, it is undeniable that a small fraction of Muslims propagate a perverted interpretation of Islam. This is the truth. Groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIL, they're not the first extremists in history to misuse God's name. We've seen it before across faiths. But right now, there is an organized extremist element that draws selectively from Islamic texts, twists them in an attempt to justify their killing and their terror. They combine it with false claims that America and the West are at war with Islam. And this warped thinking that has found adherents around the world, including, as we saw tragically in Boston and Chattanooga and San Bernardino, is real. It's there. And it creates tensions and pressure that disproportionately burden the overwhelming majority of law-abiding Muslim citizens. And the question then is, how do we move forward together? How do we keep our country strong and united? How do we defend ourselves against organizations that are bent on killing innocents? And it can't be the work of any one faith alone. It can't be just a burden on the Muslim community, although the Muslim community has to play a role. We all have responsibilities. So with the time I have left, I just want to suggest a few principles that I believe can guide us. First, at a time when others are trying to divide us along lines of religion or sect, we have to reaffirm that most fundamental of truths. We are all God's children. We're all born equal with inherent dignity. And so often we focus on our outward differences and we forget how much we share. Christians, Jews, Muslims, we're all, under our faiths, descendants of Abraham. So mere tolerance of different religions is not enough. Our faiths summon us to embrace our common humanity. O mankind, the Quran teaches, we have made you peoples and tribes that you may know one another. So all of us have the task of expressing our religious faith in a way that seeks to build bridges rather than to divide. Second, as Americans, we have to stay true to our core values, and that includes freedom of religion for all faiths. I already mentioned our founders, like Jefferson, knew that religious liberty is essential not only to protect religion, but because religion helps strengthen our nation. If it is free, if it is not an extension of the state, part of what's happened in the Middle East and North Africa and other places where we see sectarian violence is religion being a tool for another agenda, for power, for control. Freedom of religion helps prevent that, both ways. Protects religious faiths, protects the state from, or those who want to take over the state from using religious animosity as a tool for their own ends. That doesn't mean that those of us with religious faith should not be involved. We have to be active citizenry. But we have to respect the fact that we have freedom of religion. Remember, many preachers and pastors fought to abolish the evil of slavery. People of faith advocated to improve conditions for workers and ban child labor. Dr. King was joined by people of many faiths challenging us to live up to our ideals. And that civil activism, that civic participation that's the essence of our democracy, it is enhanced by freedom of religion. Now, we have to acknowledge that there have been times where we have fallen short of our ideals. By the way, Thomas Jefferson's opponents tried to stir things up by suggesting he was a Muslim. So I was not the first. No, it's true. It's true. Look it up. I'm in good company. But it hasn't just been attacks of that sort that have been used. Mormon communities have been attacked throughout our history. Catholics, including most prominently JFK, John F. Kennedy, when he ran for president, was accused of being disloyal. There was a suggestion that he would be taking orders from the Pope as opposed to upholding his constitutional duties. Anti-Semitism in this country has a sad and long history, and Jews were excluded routinely from colleges and professions and from public office. And so, if we're serious about freedom of religion, and I'm speaking now to my fellow Christians who remain the majority in this country, we have to understand, an attack on one faith is an attack on all our faiths. And when any religious group is targeted, we all have a responsibility to speak up. And we have to reject a politics that seeks to manipulate prejudice or bias and targets people because of religion. We've got to make sure that hate crimes are punished and that the civil rights of all Americans are upheld. And just as faith leaders, including Muslims, must speak out when Christians are persecuted around the world, or when anti-Semitism is on the rise. Because the fact is that there are Christians who are targeted now in the Middle East, despite having been there for centuries. And there are Jews who've lived in places like France for centuries, who now feel obliged to leave because they feel themselves under assault, sometimes by Muslims. We have to be consistent in condemning hateful rhetoric and violence against everyone, and that includes against Muslims here in the United States of America. So, none of us can be silent. We can't be bystanders to bigotry. And together we've got to show that America truly protects all faiths. Which brings me to my next point. As we protect our country from terrorism, we should not reinforce the ideas and the rhetoric of the terrorists themselves. I often hear it said that we need moral clarity in this fight. And the suggestion is somehow that if I would simply say these are all Islamic terrorists, then we would actually have solved the problem by now, apparently. Well, I agree we actually do need moral clarity. Let's have some moral clarity. Groups like ISIL are desperate for legitimacy. They try to portray themselves as religious leaders and holy warriors who speak for Islam. I refuse to give them legitimacy. We must never give them that legitimacy. They're not defending Islam. They're not defending Muslims. The vast majority of the people they kill are innocent Muslim men, women, and children. And by the way, the notion that America's at war with Islam ignores the fact that the world's religions are a part of who we are. We can't be at war with any other religion because the world's religions are a part of the very fabric of the United States, our national character. So the best way for us to fight terrorism is to deny these organizations legitimacy and to show that here in the United States of America we do not suppress Islam. We celebrate and lift up the success of Muslim Americans. That's how we show the lie that they're trying to propagate. We shouldn't play into terrorist propaganda. And we can't suggest that Islam itself is at the root of the problem. That betrays our values. It alienates Muslim Americans. It's hurtful to those kids who are trying to go to school and are members of the Boy Scouts and are thinking about joining our military. That kind of mindset helps our enemies. It helps our enemies recruit. It makes us all less safe. So let's be clear about that. Now finally, just as all Americans have a responsibility to reject discrimination. I've said this before. Muslims around the world have a responsibility to reject extremist ideologies that are trying to penetrate within Muslim communities. Here at this mosque and across our country and around the world, Muslim leaders are roundly and repeatedly and consistently condemning terrorism. And around the globe, Muslims who've dared to speak out have often been targeted and even killed. So those voices are there. We just have to amplify them more. And it was interesting in the discussion I had before I came out, some people said, why is there always a burden on us? When a young man in Charleston shoots African Americans in a church, there's not an expectation that every white person in America suddenly is explaining that they're not racist. Everybody is assumed to be horrified by that act. And I recognize that sometimes that doesn't feel fair. But part of the answer is to make sure that the Muslim community, in all of its variety, and all the good works that it's doing, and all the talent that's on display, that it's out there, visible on a consistent basis, not just at a certain moment. But what is also true is that there is a battle of hearts and minds that takes place, that is taking place right now, and American Muslims are better positioned than anybody to show that it is possible to be faithful to Islam and to be part of a pluralistic society and to be on the cutting edge of science and to believe in democracy. And so I would urge all of you not to see this as a burden, but as a great opportunity and a great privilege to show who you are. To use a little Christian expression, let your light shine. Because when you do, you'll make clear that this is not a clash of civilizations between the West and Islam. This is a struggle between the peace-loving, overwhelming majority of Muslims around the world and a radical, tiny minority. And ultimately, I'm confident that the overwhelming majority will win that battle. Muslims will decide the future of your faith, and I'm confident in the direction that it will go. But across the Islamic world, influential voices should consistently speak out with an affirmative vision of their faith. And it's happening. These are the voices of Muslim clerics who teach that Islam prohibits terrorism. For the Quran says, whoever kills an innocent, it is as if he has killed all mankind. These are the voices of Muslim scholars, some of whom join us today, who know Islam has a tradition of respect for other faiths. And Muslim teachers who point out that the first word revealed in the Quran, Iqra, means read, to seek knowledge, to question assumptions. Muslim political leaders have to push back on the lie that the West oppresses Muslims, and against conspiracy theories that says America is the cause of every ill in the Middle East. Now, that doesn't mean that Muslim Americans aren't free to criticize American U.S. foreign policy. That's part of being an American. I promise you, as the President of the United States, I'm mindful that that is a healthy tradition that is alive and well in America. But like leaders everywhere, these leaders have been offering and need to continue to offer a positive vision for progress. And that includes political and economic progress. And we have to acknowledge that much of the violence in places like the Middle East is now turning into fights between sects, Shia, Sunni, and others, where differences are often exploited to serve political agendas, as I said earlier. And this bloodshed is destroying Muslim families and communities, and there has to be global pressure to have the vision and the courage to end this kind of thinking and this approach to organizing political power. It's not historically unique. It's happened in every part of the world, from Northern Ireland to Africa to Asia to right here in the United States in the past. But it is something that we have to fight against. And we know it's possible. Across the history of Islam, different sects traditionally have lived and thrived together peacefully. And in many parts of the world, they do today, including here in the United States. Like people of all religions, Muslims living their faith in a modern pluralistic world are called upon to uphold human rights, to make sure that everyone has opportunity. That includes the aspirations of women and youth and all people. If we expect our own dignity to be respected, so must we respect the dignity of others. So let me conclude by saying that as Muslim communities stand up for the future that you believe in, that you exhibit in your daily lives, as you teach your children, America will be your partner. I will do everything I can to lift up the multiplicity of Muslim voices that promote pluralism and peace. We will continue to reach out to young Muslims around the world, empowering them with science and technology and entrepreneurship so they can pursue their God-given potential and help build up their communities and provide opportunity. It's why we will continue to partner with Muslim American communities, not just to help you protect against extremist threats, but to expand healthcare and education and opportunity. Because that's the best way to build strong, resilient communities. Our values must guide us in this work. Engagement with Muslim American communities must never be a cover for surveillance. We can't give in to profiling entire groups of people. There's no one single profile of terrorists. We can't securitize our entire relationship with Muslim Americans. We can't deal with you solely through the prism of law enforcement. We've got to build trust and mutual respect. That's how we'll keep our communities strong and our communities united. Now, as I was in discussion with the young people before I came in here, I said, this will be a process. Law enforcement has a tough job. Some of these groups are specifically trying to target Muslim youth. We're going to have to be partners in this process. There will be times where the relationship is clumsy or mishandled. But I want you to know that from the President to the FBI Director to everybody in law enforcement, my directive and their understanding is that this is something we have to do together. And if we don't do it well, then we're actually not making ourselves safer. We're making ourselves less safe. And here I want to speak directly to the young people who may be listening. You know, in our lives, we all have many identities. We are sons and daughters and brothers and sisters. We're classmates. We're Cub Scout troop members. We're followers of our faith. We're citizens of our country. And today, there are voices in this world, particularly over the internet, who are constantly claiming that you have to choose between your identities. As a Muslim, for example, or an American, do not believe them. If you're ever wondering whether you fit in here, let me say it as clearly as I can. As President of the United States, you fit in here, right here. You're right where you belong. You're part of America, too. not Muslim or American, you're Muslim and American. And don't grow cynical. Don't respond to ignorance by embracing a worldview that suggests you must choose between your faith and your patriotism. Don't believe that you have to choose between your best impulses and somehow embrace a worldview that pits us against each other, or even worse, glorifies violence. Understand your power to bring about change. Stay engaged in your community. Help move our country forward, your country forward. We are blessed to live in a nation where even if we sometimes stumble, even if we sometimes fall short, we never stop striving for our ideals. We keep moving closer to that more perfect union. We're a country where if you work hard and if you play by the rules, you can ultimately make it, no matter who you are or how you pray. It may not always start off even in the race, but here more than any place else, there is the opportunity to run that race. And as we go forward, I want every Muslim American to remember you are not alone. Your fellow Americans stand with you, just as Saba described her friends after she decided that she was going to start wearing a hijab. That's not unusual. Because just as so often we only hear about Muslims after a terrorist attack, so often we only hear about America's response to Muslims after a hate crime has happened. And we don't always hear about the extraordinary respect and love and community that so many Americans feel. I'm thinking about the 7-year-old boy in Texas who emptied his piggy bank to help a mosque that had been vandalized. Or all the faith communities that rallied around Muslim Americans after the tragedy in Chapel Hill. The churches and the synagogues standing shoulder to shoulder with their local mosques, including the woman carrying a sign saying, "We love our Muslim neighbors." Think of our men and women in uniform who, when they heard that a little girl was afraid because she was a Muslim, sent her a message, "I will protect you." I want every American to remember how Muslim communities are standing up for others as well. Because right now, as we speak, there are Muslims in Kenya who save Christians from terrorists, and Muslims who just met in Morocco to protect religious minorities, including Christians and Jews. The good people of this mosque helped the city move forward after the turmoil of last year. Muslim Americans across the country helped African American churches rebuild after arson. Remember the Muslim Americans in Boston who reached out to victims of the Marathon bombing. And the Muslim Americans across the country who raised money for the families of San Bernardino. The Muslim Americans in Chattanooga who honored our fallen service members, one of them saying, "In the name of God, the God of Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, God bless our fallen heroes." We are one American family. We will rise and fall together. It won't always be easy. There will be times where our worst impulses are given voice. But I believe that ultimately our best voices will win out. And that gives me confidence and faith in the future. After more than 200 years, our blended heritage, the patchwork quilt which is America, that is not a weakness, that is one of our greatest strengths. It's what makes us a beacon to the world. It's what led that mother who wrote to me, the one who worries about her young daughter. It led her to end her letter with hope. Despite her fears, she said, "I still believe in one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." May God's peace be upon you. May God bless the United States of America. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.